If sales send you a SaaS contract at 4:30 p.m. and says the customer wants signature today, the legal question is not whether the paper is perfect. The legal question is what needs to be fixed before signature, what can be narrowed quickly, what can be escalated, and what is simply not worth blocking the deal over. In this video, I want to walk through how to redline a SaaS contract when the business wants speed and legal as limited time. Not in a theoretical way, not as a generic lesson on reviewing contracts carefully, but as a practical review method for pressure situations. Because in real commercial work, urgency changes the method. It should not change your standards, but it absolutely changes your order of operations. So, let us start with the first principle. When time is short, do not review the contract linearly. That is the one of the biggest mistakes junior reviewer makes. They open the agreement, start at the top, and move clause by clause as if every provision deserves the same amount of attention. That is not how fast and competent review works. In a pressure deal, you need triage. You need to identify where the contract can actually hurt the company, where the drafting creates real operational or financial exposure, and where the negotiation can be simplified without weakening the company in a meaningful way. So the first thing I do is not redline immediately. I take 2 or 3 minutes and answer 4 questions. First one, what is the product or service? How important is the deal? Whose paper are we on? And what is driving the urgency? Those questions matter because they change how hard you push and where you push. A low value pilot on the customer's paper is not reviewed the same way as a strategic multi-year SaaS deal involving sensitive data and implementation obligations. A quarter-end sales push is also not the same thing as a genuine customer deadline. Sometimes it must be signed today really means sales wants movement today. Those are not the same operational facts. Once I have that context, I move directly to the clauses that create structural risk. Not routing preferences, not cosmetic edits, structural risk. In a SaaS contract under time pressure, the first issues I usually check are these: limitation of liability, indemnities, payment structure, term and termination, data protection and security commitments, intellectual property, and any service commitments that look operationally aggressive. That is where the review starts. Let us make this concrete. If the contract says liability is capped at fees paid in the last 12 months, that may be workable. If it says liability is uncapped for confidentiality, data breaches, IP infringement, and any breach of the agreement, that is not a cap in any serious economic sense. That needs attention immediately. If the indemnity says the vendor indemnifies the customer for any losses arising out of the services, that is too broad. That language may need to be narrowed to third-party claims, limited categories, and a cleaner causation standard. If the payment clause lets the customer withhold undisputed amounts because of any alleged performance issue, that is a cash collection problem, not just a legal drafting point. If the termination section allows immediate termination for convenience with no commercial protection after implementation work has already started, that affects deal economics and resource allocation. If the security exhibit requires compliance with internal customer policies that your company has never reviewed, that is an operational risk disguised as a legal attachment. So the first rule is simple. Start with the terms that can create disproportionate downside. The second principle is that you should redline by category, not by impulse. What I mean is this. When time is short, every redline should fall into one of three buckets. First, must fix before signature. There are issues that create an acceptable legal, regulatory, financial, or operational exposure. Second, should improve if there is room. These are points where the current routing is not ideal, but where fallback is available and the company can probably still sign if the business value justifies it. Third, low priority points. These are drafting cleanups, stylistic improvements, secondary clarifications, or provisions that are not worth spending negotiation capital on in a time-sensitive deal. This categorization matters because it prevents bad lawyering. Bad lawyering under pressure often looks like this: too many comments, weak prioritization, and no clear explanation of what actually matters. That frustrates sales, slows the deal, and weakens legal credibility. A much better approach is to say, these are the 4 points I need change. These are the 3 I would like to improve. Everything else is optional unless the customer reopens it. That is disciplined, and it is much easier for internal teams to act on. Now, let us talk about the actual mechanics of redlining. When you are under time pressure, do not write comments like a law review article. Your comments should do one of 3 things. Identify the issue, state the business or legal reason, and propose a workable revision. For example, do not write, "This clause is too broad and commercially unreasonable." Write something closer to, "This indemnity currently covers first-party and undefined losses. We should narrow it to third-party claims arising from IP infringement caused by the services." That is better because it is specific, actionable, and negotiation ready. Or, if the customer has inserted a provision saying the supplier will comply with all customer policies, present and future, do not just say delayed. Say, "We cannot commit to external policies that may change outside the contract. If needed, we can agree to specific documented security requirements attached as signature." Again, that is concrete. You are not just resisting, you are offering structure. And that is a key point. Fast legal review is not just about spotting risk quickly, it is about proposing fallback language quickly. This is where strong commercial lawyers distinguish themselves. They do not just identify problems, they move the paper. That means you should build a habit of thinking in fallback positions. For each major issue, ask yourself 3 questions. What is my preferred position? What is my acceptable fallback? What requires escalation if the customer refuses both? Let me give you a concrete example. Take limitation of liability. Preferred position: liability capped at fees paid in the previous 12 months with narrow carve-outs. Acceptable fallback: a cap based on annual fees, maybe a higher cap for confidentiality or data protection, but not uncapped exposure. Escalation point: uncapped liability tied to broad security, confidentiality, or performance obligations. That is a usable framework. It lets you work quickly without losing analytical discipline. Take termination for convenience. Preferred position. No unilateral customer termination for convenience in the initial term. Acceptable fallback. Termination for convenience with prior notice and payment of committed fees or implementation costs. Escalation point. Immediate exit rights for the customer combined with heavy onboarding obligation and no revenue protection. Again, that is how real review works. The next principle is to separate legal discomfort from true business risk. This is extremely important. Not every imperfect clause is dangerous, and not every strong customer ask is worth a fight. For example, if the notice clause requires email plus courier, that may be annoying, but it is not where your negotiation capital should go in an urgent SaaS deal. If the governing law is not ideal but the exposure profile is otherwise controlled and the deal size is modest, that may be survivable. If a definition is slightly overbroad but never actually drives an important remedy, that may not be the place to spend time at 50 p.m. But if the contract includes uncapped confidentiality liability, broad data security promises, open-ended indemnities, and a short breach notification timeline your company cannot operationally meet, then those are not drafting annoyances. Those are signature risk. A good redline under pressure reflects that distinction. Now, let us talk about how you communicate with sales. This is where many legal reviews fail. The issue is often not the legal analysis itself. The issue is that legal sends a red line with no internal framing. Sales sees a wall of edits, and the conversation immediately becomes emotional. That is avoidable. When time is short, legal should summarize the review in business terms. Something like this. I focused on 4 issues that materially affect risk: liability, indemnity scope, termination economics, and security obligations. I also made a few secondary cleanups, but the key negotiation points are the first 4. If the customer pushes back on liability or security language, we may need approval before signature. That kind of message does 3 things. It shows prioritization, it gives sales a usable narrative, and it tells the business where the real decision points are. That is much more effective than hiding behind tracked changes. You should also be honest about timing. If you have only done a targeted high-risk review, say that. Do not create the impression of full review if what you actually did was urgent triage. For example, given timing, I prioritize the highest risk commercial and operational terms. I have not optimized every non-critical provision. That is a professional statement. It protects legal credibility and makes the scope of review clear. Now, one more important point. In urgent deals, attachments are often where serious risk hides. People focus on the master agreement and ignore the other form, the security exhibit, the service description, the data processing addendum, and any procurement schedule. That is a mistake. In practice, some of the most dangerous commitments are buried in exhibits. Examples include security controls copied from a customer questionnaire, audit rights with vague frequency limits, service credits that stack with termination rights, breach notification deadlines that are operationally unrealistic, and data processing terms that do not match the actual product model. So if time is short, do not read only the body of the contract. Read the attachments that can create delivery obligations or uncapped exposure. That is often where the real problem is. So let me close with a practical summary. If sales want a SaaS contract signed today, the right legal response is not panic and it is not perfectionism. It is targeted, discipline, prioritization. Understand the deal. Review structural risk first. Classify issues by urgency. Redline with specific fallback language. Summarize the real decision points for sales and be clear about what has and has not been fully reviewed. That is how you help the company move quickly without pretending speed eliminates risk. Because the point of legal is an urgent deal is not to beautify the paper. It is to make sure the company is not signing something economically irrational, operationally impossible, or quietly open-ended just because the clock is running. That is what disciplined commercial review looks like. And that is also one of the clearest skills a strong commercial counsel brings to the business.